So we'll get started. This time of year, it is not hard to see skeletons. They are decorating storefronts and lawns throughout the area. Of course, as far as anyone can tell, they are fake and all in good fun. In fact, skulls and other bones have a long history in Western thought, where they're found in paintings and literature under the heading Memento Mori, remember you will die. They are supposed to remind their audience to live better lives while living. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, skulls and other bones are ubiquitous and not just for Halloween. And I want to spend some time exploring their use in organology and other artistic manifestations of their culture. While you find reproductions of skulls and bones in sculptures and tankas, I'd like to talk to you today about things that are made out of actual bone. Bones are paradoxes in Buddhist thought because they are the most permanent part of an impermanent body. Long after the flesh and organs decay, the bones usually remain. And I say usually because even bones will decay given the appropriate environmental circumstances. The use of human bones is not unusual in Tibetan culture for two reasons. First, both Vajrayana and bone theology teaches that the body is something to be escaped and serves no purpose after death. Additionally, from a practical perspective, disposing of bodies by other means is difficult in areas above the tree line, which limits the use of funeral pyres as in Buddhist ceremonies elsewhere. And where the ground is difficult to dig, as in mountainous areas where the earth is often frozen. The use of excarnation, that is exposure to elements, is not unusual therefore in this part of the world and elsewhere. In Tibetan practice, the body is taken to a monastery or temple where it is blessed, and then transported to an isolated area known as a jator, or a gift for birds, where it is dismembered and left for vultures to consume. And you'll see there I have a picture of a Himalayan vulture. This actually does not take very long. Once all the flesh is gone, the attendants pulverize the bare bones and dispose of them either by feeding them to smaller birds or by putting them into water. Any bones needed for rituals are collected before the pulverizing takes place. In some cases, the deceased may have told relatives or religious authorities that they wanted their bones to be used for ritual implements. These may be skulls and thigh bones for instruments, but bones are used for other purposes as well, to make it a kapala or a skull cup, which is used in rituals, as well as decorative armbands and aprons, which might either decorate statues or be worn by practitioners. There has been much discussion in the museum world lately concerning the ethics of displaying human remains. In the case of these instruments and other items here, there is no issue, however. Unlike bodies that were entombed or buried, the families and communities of the dead in Tibet, along with the deceased themselves, knew that their bones could be used for other purposes after death. Instruments made of human bone are beautifully crafted and decorated and are not intended to be hidden away. They are beautiful works of art. Last year, the American Museum of Natural History announced that they would no longer display items made of human bone and took several items out of the cases in the halls of ancient peoples where they had lain for decades. I wrote a letter to the director explaining that in Tibetan culture, the use of bone was traditionally sanctioned, and it was considered a blessing for the deceased for his or her bones to be used for ritual purposes. I never received a reply, and the items, as far as I can tell, because I haven't visited the museum since December 2023, remain unseen by the public. I pointed out that in an article about bone instruments and hypoallergic, which is an online newsletter devoted to art, the provenance of one of the items, a bone apron, was identified as having been brought back to England by a member of the Young Husband expedition of 1904, in which Tibetan soldiers attempted to fend off a much better equipped British army and failed. But that the moral issue is here is how it was acquired, and not that the piece was made of bone. Although some Tibetan items made on display in museums may have been obtained by military excursions, most were not. Indeed, as someone who has been collecting Himalayan instruments since the 1980s, I can tell you that there are more Tibetan items available through auction houses now than there were then. That is because of the Tibetan diaspora of the late 1950s. It is estimated that 100,000 Tibetans left their country during the political upheaval that followed the Chinese invasion, and many of them took ritual implements with them. The children and heirs of these immigrants are now selling these works of art. Let us now look at the main implements made of bone. The kangling, which is the trumpet you see right there, is a labial aerophone. That is a wind instrument whose sound is made by the player's lips vibrating against one end of the instrument, as in a bugle. Here, the Tibetan name is misleading because ling in Tibetan means something like flute. Yet this instrument is not the type of instrument where the sound is made by air hitting an edge, either as in a transverse flute or the fipple flute, which is another word for the recorder. This instrument is sometimes used in large ensembles, but often is sounded alone in what are called tantric rituals, that is, special events conducted in solitary or in small groups, intended to speed up the process of enlightenment. While metal versions of this instrument may be constructed to look like a dragon or some mythical beast, the most notorious versions of this instrument in the West is that constructed of a human thigh bone. Sources in English vary as to what type of bones work best. Some will say that it is the bone of the thief is most efficacious, while others recommend the bone of a nun. It is obvious that there are variant thoughts on the subject, and also most likely the question of practicality. One must use whichever bones are available, and also the fact that once devoid of flesh, it is difficult to ascertain the source of the bone. The sound of the kangling is said to be pleasing for wrathful deities, that is, the angry aspects of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who labor to eliminate obstacles to enlightenment, while being terrifying to evil spirits. The bone is cut 3.5 hand lengths from the knee, which is why they are all of similar size, regardless of how tall or short the person was. The two holes where the knee joint would be are called the nostrils of the horse, because the sound of the instrument reminds the player of the mythical horse who will, quote, carry the faithful after their death into paradise. At least this is the interpretation of Berthold Laufer, a native of Cologne, writing for the Chicago Field Museum in 1923. However, this interpretation sounds too Germanic to me and not sufficiently Buddhist. It really is something that comes right out of the third act of Die Valkyrie. The name of this instrument is also given to a place in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, where the area right below the Potala Palace is known as the place of the Kangling. According to a legend, in the 17th century, a holy man, La Sun, blew his kangling upon arriving at the palace to announce his presence to the Dalai Lama, who was expecting him. The palace guard, not knowing who the holy man was or what that he was expected, tied him to the long stone of the Lhasa or Do ring, a stela outside the entrance to the Jokang monastery, in which is inscribed the text of the Tibetan Chinese peace treaty from the 9th century. He did this because it was considered improper to blow such a loud sound nearby the Potala Palace where the Dalai Lama was. The sage shook the monolith and all the surrounding areas, though it seemed like there was an earthquake. And this attracted the attention of the Dalai Lama, who, on seeing Latsung bound up, ordered him released. The area where he blew the kangling has been named after the instrument ever since. These instruments have also been made from metal, from the earliest of times, one of which in the shape of a dragon is on display in one of the cases in the back. Also on display is one made of yak bone, which is made of two smaller bones joined together, and so has a metal band in the middle where the two bones are connected. You may also see one of those in the display case. Since no new instruments made of bone are now available, modern ones are made of acacia wood or even of resin. Very rarely, conlang are made of the antlers of Asian deer. These are used only for very specific rituals and are very rare. You may see one in the display case on the far wall. This is the only one on display in the Western world. There is another one in the collection of the Kunstmuseum Den Haag in the Netherlands, but they no longer have any musical instruments on display. I have also heard of these instruments being made out of tiger bones, but I've never seen one, nor do I know of any in any museum collections. The other type of instrument made of human bone is called the tod nya, or the more frequently encountered Sanskrit term, damaru, and that's the little drum right there. This is a percussion made out of two craniums, each of which has a drum skin attached to it, with two pellets attached by strings around the center, so that the sound is made by the pellets hitting the drum head when it is oscillated. The tops of the skulls are cut off, and they are held together with a ring of wood and glue. Some writers state that pieces of paper containing mantras written on them should be enclosed in the two halves, but unless they have been glued in place, they would presumably make a sound when shaken, and all of the instruments I have examined don't make sounds. There is usually a long, colorful tail on it called a chopin. This is a soft-sounding instrument and is used in private devotions as it would partly be here in large ensembles, although sometimes groups of people play them simultaneously during meditation sessions. That the instrument should be made of one male and one female skull, but as I've said before, it may be difficult to be choosy when gathering the raw materials. In the absence of skulls, they may be made of other materials. There is one made of clay on display here with an inscription around the edges. In the type of tantric practice known as chod, the damaru is made of wood and is larger. The first non-instrument we will consider is the kapala or todpa. The former is the Sanskrit term, the latter is classical Tibetan. This is a cup or bowl made out of the top of a skull. You can see one right there. It is used in both Hindu and Buddhist rituals, and therefore probably dates back to the beginning of Buddhism. It can be on the plain side or it can be extremely decorated and may have a metal base and cover, but it doesn't have to. But there is a beautiful one in the case in the back there. The sources are very diverse on what kind of skull should be used, and in addition to the age and sex of its origin, great emphasis is placed on the presence or not of sutures inside the skull. Skulls are considered karmic vehicles, and as such, they contain the good and or bad qualities of the person they came from. Therefore, it is considered important to carefully choose the correct skull for whatever ritual or situation is intended. For instance, a skull used in a ritual devoted to Palden Lama, a female deity, would not be suitable for one intended for Yakatama, which is the male destroyer of death. In monasteries, kapalas are used to present offerings to wrathful deities and are filled with dough in the shape of body parts such as eyes and ears. The kapala is often found in Tibetan tankas and sculptures, especially in depictions of multi-armed beings. In person, it is often used in tantric rituals, especially in those of chod. Tantras are very specific Buddhist texts that can assist a person in attaining enlightenment over one lifetime. There are different ways and schools of thought as to how to do it, and one of them is chod, which means separate, and requires the practitioner to spend time among dead bodies to help eliminate fear. A much more common item, often constructed out of bone, is the mala or rosary, and there's one on the second table over there. Most followers of Vajrayana Buddhism have one, whether clergy or layperson. The mala contains 108 beads of the same size made of bone, and as this number is considered holy in Tibetan Buddhism. In addition, there are some other larger beads made of other materials such as coral or turquoise. Supposedly, the most efficacious malas are made from the skulls of 108 different people. We are told that in ancient times, there were malas used by Chod practitioners where the skulls were taken from 108 different charnel grounds, which are the places where the bodies are exposed to vultures. While there were certainly monks who created their own malas, most, especially those made out of bone, were constructed by skilled bone carvers, which at one point was a common profession in Tibet, although it no longer exists. Malas and other bone implements are no longer made in Tibet. If the mala is an implement used by many Tibetan Buddhists, the rusnyan, or bone apron, is used by very few. Along with other bone ornaments for the head, ears, and neck, it is worn only by certain tantric practitioners, especially those devoted to the deity Chakrasamvara, who is also known as Haruta, or maybe called a Haruta, depending on the school of Buddhism you're dealing with. The practitioners often hold rituals by themselves on charnel grounds. Bone ornaments are also used for ritual dance performances, but these aprons and other accessories are different from the ones used for private meditation. The bones are constructed of many pieces of bone, finely carved both into beads and into plaques, and often contain impressions of skulls. And later on you can look at the one that I have spread out there for you. The use of human bones in ritual implements and the depiction of skulls in Tibetan art aligns with the practice of Maransati, or the contemplation of death. This practice is found in all varieties of Buddhism and serves to remind the practitioner that death can strike at any time, so one should live accordingly. It is accelerated in Tantric Buddhist practice, in which the person who wishes to achieve enlightenment in one, namely this, lifetime. As you encounter images of bones when trick-or-treating, remember that, as mentioned before, their use in art is solely not a Tibetan idea. I am reminded of the Capuchin Church in Rome, where the bones of around 4,000 monks are arranged in various artistic patterns in chapels, along with the reminder, as you are, we once were, as we are, you will become. Thank you.
I'm gonna try to see how loud I can get it.
All right.
It's gonna get loud.
Go. Do it.
You see everything that blew out of it? That was a little alarming.